York, trabajó en el Banco Mundial, se formó en su Serbia natal, pero hoy vive en Estados Unidos. Escribió Desigualdad Mundial, un libro que te recomiendo si te interesan estos temas. Y como te decía, lo entrevistamos hace un año exactamente. Le pregunté si el gobierno argentino no pudo desplegar los programas de estímulo anticrisis que desplegaron otros países. Bueno, si ante la frazada corta que evidentemente enfrenta, ¿qué conviene? ¿Sostener las tarifas con subsidios? ¿Destinar de vuelta dinero al IFE, por ejemplo, para atender a los más postergados? ¿O rebajarle impuestos a la clase media, como ahora propone Sergio Massa, que lo va a empezar a discutir? Esto respondió.
Say about the stimulus that you mentioned of $100. I think that's a significant, first significant amount for many people who are receiving that. And secondly, it actually, for many of them, can make a huge change between not having anything and having $100. It is actually would buy food, you know, possibly pay the rent if they need to pay that, if it's not actually already accepted that they can carry it over. So it does make a huge difference, even small amounts. And, you know, there are small amounts for rich people, but there are not small amounts for, you know, people with low incomes. And if you look, for example, in many of the programs in Latin America, as you know, the amounts that were paid by household were always small. But if you have this, like Bolsa Familia in Brazil, if you have these large programs, they really include lots of people. And the total fiscal cost of the government is not enormous. And yet they do make a difference for many people. You can see the logic of lowering taxes on the middle class, because the assumption was that the middle class was quite also affected by the crisis. So they were the losers as well. And then lowering the tax on them is just making situation a little bit better for them. And maybe also it is discouraging tax evasion, because if your tax rates are lower, maybe fewer people would actually not pay taxes. I think it is, as I said before, I think it's a difficult situation without knowing the numbers and knowing actually really what is happening. And of course, I don't know the Argentinian fiscal numbers. I think it's difficult to say, you know, up front. Obviously, the richer the country, the more space you have to do things. And the US has this clearly shown that if there was a, you know, will to do something, US has actually spent an incredible number, I mean, more than 25% of GDP on these stimulus packages. That was never seen before in history. I see the logic also on the government side that you have to actually, the largest constituency in the country is still the middle class. If you actually continue taxing the middle class regardless of whatever is happening, it's not a very good idea. I actually thought in the beginning that a temporary 1 year special tax on the highest, either we talked about that, you mentioned that a minute ago, on wealth or very high incomes might be a reasonable solution, temporary solution, because it would also give these people a feeling that they are not going to keep on paying this forever. So this is actually a special tax. There are certain subsidies that make quite a lot of sense. I think particularly subsidies that are poor. We have seen them, for example, in transportation. For, you know, you don't have a city transportation in any place in the world which can actually maintain itself. So it needs to be subsidized one way or another. And when you subsidize it, you tend to subsidize poor people who don't have their own cars, for example, and who need to go to work. So I think these rules apply now. It seems to me even more now, because the situation is more difficult for everybody, including, as I said before, for the middle class, and especially for the poor people. You know, when you think of this, like, how could you take away subsidies, for example, on public transportation when people's jobs are uncertain, that sometimes they have to go. Actually, I was reading about that. They have to go to show up at a potential place of work, and depending then on the demand and depending on what is happening on that day, they get either a job or not. So who is then going to start paying in order to go there to find out that there is no job? So you have to take, I think, all these things into account. And in my opinion, like subsidization during, again, a very special period like this year and last year makes in many respects lots of sense.
Es interesante porque esto que nos está haciendo matarnos entre nosotros, los otros países, los países con posibilidades, lo hicieron todo. O sea, le bajaron los impuestos a la clase media, subsidiaron todo por la pandemia y además le extendieron dinero sin contraprestación alguna a los que se caían del mapa. Nosotros no tenemos, por eso es muy curioso ver a funcionarios, exfuncionarios macristas del área económica opinar sobre esta situación calamitosa. Porque esta es la situación calamitosa que dejaron ellos. Nos dejaron maniatados en la cubierta del Titanic. No solamente en la cubierta del Titanic. Nos dejaron ahí, pero maniatados. Pablo,